done that.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Dark Outside. My name is Innes Smith. I've been invited to speak to you about the paranormal perspective on the dark and all things dark. If you could go to the next slide, please. Okay, that should have a wee menu there. Now, I'm prone to ridiculous amounts of waffle, so I'm going to try and aim for half an hour with plenty of time at the end of my talk so you can ask any questions. If anyone's just too confused or doesn't understand what I'm on about, then by all means just stick your hand up and ask a question, and if I can answer it, I'll answer it. But if you can save your questions to the end, I would be grateful. Okay, so first of all, introduce myself. My name is Innes Smith. I'm a writer and I'm an actor. I mostly do voiceovers. I mostly write educational short films for the BBC. In my spare time, I am also a paranormal investigator. I've been an investigator since the year 2000. I joined the Scottish Society for Psychical Research in 1998. It's Scotland's oldest and largest continuing organisation dedicated to investigating the paranormal in a scientific manner. So there you go, that's the spiel. Now, first of all, I'd like to say that I have no idea what you think about the paranormal. I would like to say that I am an open-minded skeptic. Now, the society to which I belong, we hold no corporate views, okay? Now, so you may be somebody that thinks the paranormal is all a complete lot of nonsense, or you think it's absolutely all real. Well, I'll guarantee that I will disappoint all of you equally. I've been looking into this subject for quite a while, and it is quite a confusing and nuanced subject. And hopefully I'm just going to prove this to you by looking at a paranormal perspective on darkness. So first of all, we're going to have a look at darkness in myth and ritual. Now, it's worthwhile pointing out that before we thought of ourselves as thinking logically, we thought analogically. So that means that essentially we saw the entire world in terms of analogies, similarities, and everything in terms of sympathetic likeness. And by that I mean that we are used to assuming that agency, the cause of things, can be something that is impersonal, or we say, you know, something happened, whereas our ancestors might have thought, who did that? Instead of what happened, who happened? So that's why it was very easy to anthropomorphize the entire cosmos. And I'll go and talk on about how certain things that we now understand to be natural used to be thought of as a personal or an individual agency. Now, the very obvious thing to start off by saying about the dark is that it's very hard to think about the dark in terms of without thinking about the dark compared to the light. And indeed, so did seem to all the different ancient mythologies and religions. Hesiod came up with a wonderful quote here, that the darkness is the mother to all gods. And so there's that wonderful, interesting duality, that darkness by itself is, of course, the source of all creation and cosmos. So there is no moral judgment about darkness, because it is, of course, the primal chaos, the darkness, where everything springs from. But once light springs out of darkness, there is that strange duality. So in ancient mythologies, this was recognised. This was recognised. You can't say the dark is wholly bad, because it's where everything came from. But once you compare it to light, it takes on these analogical, these metaphorical associations, that light becomes, well, certainly if you belong to a light cult or worship the sun, then the darkness becomes a bad thing or more negative. It's interesting. I was just checking up on Mumsnet, interestingly, because darkness has often been associated with passive and feminine principles. Sorry to disappoint you, feminists, but it's often been associated with that, and a lot of that has to do with I'm just checking to see if there are any children in here, but in case there are, I'll just say you can imagine the sort of sexual metaphors or reproduction involved in essentially comparing darkness, perhaps dark places, with perhaps light substances. So it's a very obvious analogy that people follow with darkness and light, but of course that's not making a moral judgment against darkness whatsoever. But it also might be due to the fact that apparently I've heard midwives argue about this. Are there any midwives here, or indeed any mothers in here? But there was a very big debate about, oh yes, more children are born during the night. Now, I've heard, this is why I was on Mumsnet, there was a big debate, and they were saying, well, no, that's not really true, but most women start labour at night time. So that idea that darkness is associated with fertility and birth. Now, the other thing about darkness in use with ritual is shamans often use anything to get into an altered state of consciousness so they can have some kind of numinous or exciting, exotic experience. And in the past they've used lots of things, whether it's psychoactive substances, something to have a nibble on, whether some of them starve themselves, some of them used to torture themselves through pain, and some of them would actually just sit in the dark. It was apparently one of the favourite tactics of a lot of Indian tribes in America. They used to just sit in the dark. And according to an anthropologist, Michael Harner, he believes this way, the literal translation of enlightenment is when people would wait in the dark and literally light would appear. Which brings me to the mystery cults. Now there's something wonderful about the mystery cults. If we have any historians or classicists here, the mystery cults are, surprise, surprise, a mystery. History has lots of gossip, hearsay, lots of ancient writers write about it, and there were lots of mystery cults. So we're talking about ancient Greece and Egypt, so there was gods such as Isis, there was Osiris, there was Orpheus, there was Dionysus. The most famous mystery cult was based in Eleusis in Greece, which was near Athens. And the rumours are that these extraordinary cults would have secret ceremonies during the night. Some of them would last for a fortnight. There were lesser mysteries, there were greater mysteries. But at the climax, there was an extraordinary secret experience that would transform people's lives. So these people were known as the Illumined Ones, and anyone that met somebody who had been initiated into a mystery cult, they talked to them, they're having no fear of death. Whatever they were exposed to transformed their life, and they never told anybody else. There are, of course, rumours. An ancient Greek writer called Polyaenus came up with a wonderful tale that apparently he managed to spy an act of worship or initiation, and he said that the temple was, quote, all full of gods, and then he collapsed and died. So it's a wonderful story, we don't know if it's true. Also rumours about people seeing that they saw the sun at midnight. So yet again we have this interesting idea that the darkness is used as a source to bring in new light. We might understand it in the computer age as essentially wiping your hard drive, wiping all the memory, tabula rasa, and starting again, and that's where you're reborn. So that's the darkness in myth and ritual. Could say more about that. We've only got half an hour, so we'll move on to the next one. So, denizens of the dark. We have there a cemetery with a revenant or a vampire going, yikes! Now, vampires are part of our folklore and mythology for a reason. People thought they were real, and they really came to, let's say, in Europe's attention when Austria annexed Serbia. So this was back in 1718. Austria, this European power, took control of parts of Serbia, and being a very efficient imperial bureaucracy, not only did they enforce military rule, but also they were very officious in recording all the crimes or misdemeanours of the local populace. And it so happened that they noticed in 1725 that in one village called Kosivia, there was they had this nasty habit of digging up corpses and killing them. Now I'm going to tell you about one of the most repeated stories of vampirism that happened in 1725, and the vampire was called Peter Blagojevich, and what happened is he died. He died of unexplained causes, but then other people in the village started to die. And because they started to die after a 24-hour illness, people thought this is an outbreak of vampirism. There's no other rational explanation. People also said that they would see him. His wife said that she saw him come during the night, come to him during the night. So what they did was they said, well, we better dig up these corpses and kill them. So this is where we get this wonderful first-hand account by this Austrian bureaucrat saying, oh well, oof. And basically, villages used to be abandoned. If you didn't nip a vampire outbreak in the bud, they used to abandon villages in Serbia. So they said, oh well, we'll for the status quo, for the peace of the community, we'll let this go ahead. So they dug up the corpse, and much to their surprise, they said that he had an exceptionally ruddy complexion. Instead of being old, he had new skin. In fact, the nails in his fingers were shiny and new. He was soft. His body was pliable. Also, he had blood. He actually had blood on his lips. And he said he actually looked really, really ruddy, in good health, and his hair had actually grown. And they said, well, this is a clear sign of vampirism. And of course, they rammed a stake through his heart, and they were satisfied that they had killed him. Now, this is not an isolated case. This happened an awful lot. A folklorist, Paul Barber, wrote a fantastic book all about this, and he basically unpacked the whole thing in terms of this was a folklore explanation or an analogical explanation of two different sets of phenomena misunderstood. One was epidemic illness. It's always quite hard for you to think back to the past and imagine how it would have, how people would have understood people getting sick and dying if you had no idea of viruses or bacteria. What did people think was happening? And people often thought it was a judgment from God, or it was some kind of evil spirit, or demonic possession, or vampirism. And of course, what do we all know about vampirism? They spread. It's epidemics. Now, they thought it was an epidemic of vampirism. It was just an epidemic. But when you couple that with the fact that people had a tremendous ignorance about decomposition, that's why you get this myth of vampirism. Because you can dig up a corpse after being in the ground for 4 weeks, and the corpse would look exactly like that. We all have misconceptions about how corpses decompose. What they mistook for somebody who was being very ruddy and in good health, bloated with gas. What they thought was a person looking really, really shiny and healthy with lovely pink skin, the top layer of skin had sloughed off, had rotted. The new fingernails, the old fingernails had rotted. The hair had grown. This is still a myth that people believe. Did you know that the hair and nails still grow after death? No, they do not. They never do. All that happens is the body dehydrates and the skin shrinks, so it looks as if the hair grows and the fingernails grow. That's what happens. But essentially, and also rigor. Rigor starts after a few, depending on the climate, rigor starts after a few hours after decomposition, but then it stops and people loosen up again. And of course, there's other myths about vampires that we all accept and understand. Children are present. But the Austrian bureaucrat also commented on, because he was too polite to mention it, he said that the vampire showed, quote, other wild signs. And if you want to ask me what those other wild signs are, speak to me afterwards. So, so there is this reason why people believe in vampires. But what Paul Barber did miss out is something else that another folklorist, David Hufford, picked up. And it's the notion of what he called the supernatural attack tradition. He started off in America, and he actually surveyed his students, and the experiment has been repeated all around the world with different sets of people. have you woken up in the middle of the night, unable to move, convinced that somebody else is in the room with you, you're terrified, and perhaps you can see them too? Now, he found out that across the world, 19 to 23% have this experience in their life. Now, the amount of people that are here listening to me, that must have been at least a dozen. At least a dozen people in here have had that kind of experience. I know I have. So other people must have had this experience. Now, medical science say that this is called sleep paralysis, but it's not exactly sleep paralysis. Hufford was quite keen to point this out. It's a misdiagnosis. But when you put those two experiences together, the idea of sleep paralysis and vampirism, then they merge together and they become they can be interpreted very convincingly to be some kind of outbreak of vampirism. So you have that vampirism experience. It's just, before I move on from vampirism, you can ask me more questions about it. It's interesting to note that Greece also has a very strong vampire tradition. They call vampires vrykolakas. If there are any Greeks here, I apologise for the pronunciation, but vrykolakas means drum-like. And it's made drum-like for two reasons: because the skin is tight as a drum, the vampire skin is tight as a drum, but also because they knock on your door. And in some villages in Greece, it's what they do is they always wait for a second knock. They never open somebody that only knocks for one time. So they have that thing. But there's a wonderful piece of Greek folklore that Santorini is famous for its vampires. And indeed, in Greece they have a saying which is exactly the same as our bringing coals to Newcastle, and it's bringing vampires to Santorini. And guess who now lives there? Rupert Murdoch. It's now this home to the super rich. So maybe the Greeks were right after all. So there's lots of interesting things to be told about vampires and those kind of denizens of the dark. So we'll move on to the next one. We've not got much time. Okay, so darkness and spiritualism. Now, there's so much to be said about spiritualism, but the very, very quick version is that modern spiritualism started in a small little shack outside a town called Rochester in New York State in America in 1848. A family called the Fox family, and basically they heard scratching sounds and rapping sounds in the bedroom, and the Fox sisters said that they had a little a report. Funnily enough, they made noises, they made scratching noises, clicking noises, and the noises came back. And that was essentially the birth of spiritualism. Is the local villagers came, they listened to what happened, and spiritualism spread rapidly. It's extraordinary that in America in 1850 that there was about 8 spiritualist newspapers in America, and they claimed 3 million adherents in America at that time. So it was quite an incredible phase. It was brought to England in 1853 by Mrs. Haydon, who's essentially the support act for an electrobiologist, somebody who was doing mesmerism, a sort of hypnotist act. And spiritualism is enormous. Now, the thing we all know about spiritualism is they have seances. And what light conditions do they hold these in? The dark. So, from a spiritualist point of view, and there are still spiritualists that have seances, and they have seances in the dark. From a spiritualist point of view, is they say spirit beings and spirit lights are very, very subtle. They're subtle energies. And if you want to have a chance of seeing them, or having those kind of experiences, you have to stick all this kind of interfering light off. That's the only way that you have a chance to encourage these subtle energies to come through and build up. You can't have that level of light pollution or light interference. However, skeptics would then point out that darkness is also a very convenient way to get away with cheating. And it's fair to say, I apologise for any spiritualists are in tonight, but spiritualism is very much like a stick of rock in which the word fraud is shot right way through, because spiritualists have been caught at it so many times. It's quite extraordinary. Even the young girls that essentially ended up touring the world proselytizing spiritualism, the Fox sisters, is they actually eventually confessed. And they confessed that they basically had just had double jointed toes, and they could click their toes, and also they confessed that they were just very. People think that somebody's amazing at mind reading, but they say it's amazing if you essentially. Communication would be set up as such that go through the alphabet. So you would sit there and go A, B, C, C, C. I hope it's Charlie, I hope it's Charlie. So that's how it would go. But they said, you might be thinking, all right, I'm waiting for C, I'm waiting for C, I'm giving off no signs, I'm giving off no signs. But if you try this, be a fake medium, try it with somebody else, ask them to go through the alphabet, and and often you'd say, oh well, that was a bit hard, and we'll try it again, go through the alphabet, and the second time you see them A, B, C, D, because they want the answer, so they always pause longer, there's more expectancy, it's really easy to read them. So whilst there was an awful lot of fraud in spiritualism, I'm not going to write it all off. However, spiritualism took place largely in the dark, and often even people said, "Oh, a seance took place in very good light." It was in good light. There was one medium who was essentially a cross between sort of Uri Geller and Elvis. He was a mega star of his day. He actually married Russian aristocracy. He knew absolutely. He was right up there. It was called Daniels and Glass Hume. He was actually from Curry, near Edinburgh. He then left to live in America, and then he came back to the UK and then travelled the world. He was a superstar of his day, and they always say he was never caught. He was never caught, this man. But spiritualists always say, oh, it was always, he actually used to hold seances in good light and good light. It's fair to say that what spiritualists thought were good light was not what everyone else might say was good light, in which essentially there was no gaslight, maybe the dying embers of a coal fire, and people used to say I could only see, I could just see maybe just a vague white blob where his face was, if that. So it's certainly possible there was opportunities to have mischief in the dark. We can talk more about spiritualist fraud if you want. I'll talk a wee bit about the people that used to investigate the spiritualists. If you move on to the next slide, please. Now, the reason why I'm going to mention this organisation, these gentlemen, this is the Society for Psychical Research, which was founded in London in 1882. And from the left, we have Sir William Barrett, who was a professor of physics at Dublin University, or Trinity University in Dublin. Professor Henry Sidgwick in the middle, who was a professor of philosophy at Cambridge. And then Frederick Myers at the end, who was a classicist, a Greek poet and a classicist. Now, we all have to thank Mr. Myers this evening. We have to thank Mr. Myers because Mr. Myers, being a classicist and an expert in ancient Greece, actually brought us two words which we use a lot. Well, I certainly use the word telepath and telepathy a lot. He brought that word into the fore. However, another word that you might not think he might have brought was the word subliminal. F.W. Myers, in the context of investigating mesmerism and hypnotism and spiritualism, was very much interested in the hidden powers of men and women. What they would be, he had this burning notion that our conscious selves was but a mere shadow of our inner potential. So he was actually a contemporary of Freud, and actually came up with his own ideas before, if not at the same time, as Freud. But because Freud was a neurologist and a psychologist, his ideas of the unconscious or the subconscious went to the fore. But because he was involved in psychical research, his ideas of the subliminal were ignored. But when anyone talks about the unconscious and that pioneer Sigmund Freud, Myers is a very much overlooked thinker in the field, and he did bring us the word subliminal, because liminal just really means beach. So if he didn't attach these psychological notions to the word subliminal, subliminal would just mean where the crabs hang out under the beach. So he came up with subliminal. So I can talk more about the SPR and the early investigations and the fun that they used to have in the dark, but let's move on to the next one. Okay, psychology of perception. Now, this is a very complicated subject. Psychologists, certainly psychologists sceptical of the paranormal, are often very quick to dismiss anomalous experience, whilst perhaps failing to acknowledge that they themselves have no overall theory of perception. Not only have they not worked consciousness out, but perception they've not worked out. There is no theory of perception. We don't know how it works. And what's more interesting about the theory of perception is we have lots and lots of really, really fascinating experiments. Lots of really, really fascinating experiments that tell us contradictory things. They're not that in one breath there's so much information out there that we can't possibly take it in, and on the other side we're actually exceptionally good at taking in subliminal information. So they don't necessarily make sense, and there's lots of interesting experiments. In the context of dark, though, somebody did have a quite interesting experiment with darkness. It was a man called Donald Hebb, D.O. Hebb. He was a pioneer in psychology, Canadian, and in 1954 he did what was essentially a sensory deprivation experiment. Now, he did these sensory deprivation experiments where people would, in the dark, put little mittens on, completely sealed off from the outside world. The only contact with the outside world they would have for limited periods of time were food and drink. Now, within hours, and especially within days, these test subjects had such profound distortions of perception that some people thought that he was actually projecting films onto their goggles. Some people had out-of-body experiences. Some people actually lost the ability to even think of themselves as an embodied creature. Quite extraordinary results. And after he conducted this experiment, US Navy psychiatrists were very, very interested in this. And they went on to take the experiments further and actually use flotation tanks to aid the whole sensory deprivation. Now, it's since come out that D.O. Hebb was actually funded by the CIA, basically to research torture and counter-torture techniques. And yet, people are now used to thinking of flotation tanks as being a relaxing treat when you get given a voucher. So the next time you are listening to whale song and sitting in a flotation tank, that originated with CIA funding how to torture people more effectively. But these extraordinary experiences, and people were really quite distorted. And when the US Navy actually conducted these experiments in flotation tanks, they said they had even more profound results using flotation tanks in a much, much shorter period of time. So it's interesting. It almost ties up with the experiences of the shamans using darkness as this to initiate these tremendous and extraordinary hallucinations. So can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, cases. So we'll move on to the next case. So the first case I'm going to talk about, if you move on to the next one, please, thanks. Right, okay. So this is, I'm going to talk about a couple of my cases, but this is a really great case, and it's not mine. It's not mine because it happened in 1963. So there you have is you have a couple of gentlemen there. Is you have David Phelan, who was 58, and Henry Throne, or Henry Hank Throne, who was 20 at the time. They were both miners, coal miners, in a small town of Shepton in Pennsylvania. And on the 3rd of August, they were down the mine with another gentleman called Louis Bova, when they had a catastrophic collapse. There was a tunnel collapse, a pit collapse. Very sadly, Louis Bova jumped to one side and was crushed, and they never recovered the body. However, Phelan and Throne found themselves in a small cavern in the pitch dark. Now, what happened was 5 days later they managed to bore a communication hole down, and then 2 weeks later they were rescued. And when they were rescued, David Phelan asked immediately for a psychiatric evaluation. And when he was evaluated, they said, no, you're absolutely fine, you're fine, you're fine. The psychiatrist asked them, why? And they were saying, well, we saw some pretty amazing things. And he talked a wee bit about the things that they saw. And of course, word got around, but as soon as word got around, people went, did you hear what those crazy miners saw? They clamped up, they didn't say a word. So it took them a long time to talk. And a year later, a local radio host interviewed them, and he spoke at length with them, and there was a good rapport. So the two miners talked about their experiences, and they're quite extraordinary. What happened was within 24 hours, in the pitch darkness, David Fellon could see a man on the wall and a golden cross. Now he kept it quiet because he thought, I'm losing my mind. Not only did he see this man and thought, I'm losing my mind, but he recognised him. It was Pope John the 23rd, who had died 8 weeks earlier. And he didn't mention it for fear of losing his sanity. But what amazed him was that Hank Throne said, can you see that guy on the wall? Who's that man smiling on the wall? And he went, oh, right, it's the Pope. It's the Pope. And he went, oh, right, okay. Oh, right. And over the next few days, extraordinary things happened. Now, what's interesting about this was not the fact that they saw things, but they seemed to see mostly the same thing. With the next few days, Henry Throne saw what he called the linemen, people that looked like lumberjacks, who arrived in what he said were horseless chariots with lights, with cone lights on their head. And when they arrived, they spooled out this big coil of wire, and they were so real to him that he thought they were actually rescuers, other miners. And when he shouted to them, yeah, can we get some light in here? They disappeared and it was dark. What was interesting was that David Fellon actually said that he could only see them. He saw the same people, but he could only see them from the waist up and in profile. And he also said that the lights that they shone from their head weren't constant, but were intermittent. They strobed. So it was interesting. They were almost seeing the same thing, but different. Now, what's interesting about that is after they disappeared, it's funnily enough, they did bring light. Over the next few days, a luminescence appeared in the cavern. And David Fellon described it as it was like steam. It was like a blue steam. He said it was strong enough light for them to cast a shadow. Now, people said, you couldn't have possibly seen a light. But they said, well, yeah, we could see a light. Not only could we see a light, but how do you explain the fact that we managed to do all this extraordinary wooden prop work to prop the cavern up? We couldn't have done that in the pitch darkness. And sure enough, in this light, they did a tremendous amount of work to actually prop up the cavern. Now, once they had the light, they still saw more and more extraordinary things. The only time they were actually really afraid was when they actually saw marble steps disappearing upwards up into a door. The marble steps were 12 foot wide, and they became terribly afraid. And David Fellon said we were both really quite drawn to going up those steps, but we knew that we couldn't actually go there. To go there would be our doom. And it became such a kind of a weird, kind of tempting dilemma for them that the only injury sustained by both of the trapped miners during the whole 2 weeks, they were down there for 2 whole weeks, was actually Hank Throne banging on the door, because he was banging on the door and he actually damaged his hand, and then the apparition disappeared. Now, the reason at one point they thought they were going to be saving us. Extraordinary. This is before the communication shaft was actually drilled through, and they said that they saw these really dignified, good-looking people appear. They were exotically dressed in kimonos. They even had slightly pointed ears, and they came to them and spoke to them. And they had these really odd signs, these plaques that were made with lots and lots of rows, and they had pegs in them. And they asked them, "Do you see your names on this plaque?" And they looked, and they said, "No." And it was then that they thought to themselves, "We're going to be okay. We're going to be safe." So that was an interesting point. What's really interesting is when the communication line, the borehole came through, and they were supplied with food and light, the apparitions did not stop. They even said that when food came down the hole, they could actually see small childlike creatures dancing around the hole, and you could actually light them up with your torches that they had. The only time they were really scared was they said there was these figures would come in twos, and they said they looked quite menacing, but the closer they got, the more insubstantial they got. And what was really odd is the thing that would drop away first was their legs, and then their arms, and then their torsos, and then they would just disappear. So all these extraordinary experiences. Now, it's really interesting what they experienced, because you could, at a stretch, dismiss entirely what happened as hallucination, and hallucination in which there was a retroactive, essentially, collusion between one person who was more strong-willed and somebody who was more weak-willed, and essentially it was a folie à deux, in which let's assume that David Fellon actually just made it all up, and this poor fella just went, yeah, I can see it. But everybody that spoke to them, the two men, they said, no, we had this experience, we saw these same things, we weren't exactly the same all the time, but we had these same things. So I think it's a really interesting case about these extraordinary experiences and things that happen in the dark. So we can move on to the next slide. Okay, that's a wee drawing of me doing my paranormal investigating. I have to warn you that if they made a Ghostbusters film about me, there would be no jumpsuits or proton packs. I'm just a paranormal social worker. I just sit down and speak to people, and that's a wee joke there saying, "Are you on medication to a ghost?" But this is a wee story about Mrs. V. McGee. Now, names have been changed to protect the innocent. Now, it was actually Mrs. V. McGee's daughter who actually contacted me about all her extraordinary experiences, and she used to be terrified of the dark. She had lots of extraordinary experiences, but when it became clear that her mother also had these extraordinary experiences, then it was interesting, some kind of tradition within the family that these sort of events happened. So whether or not nature, nurture, some kind of social contagion, who knows? You could argue that till the cows come home. But what I will do is I will read you what Mrs. V. McGee said. Okay, her name has been changed. Now, whenever you pick up a book about ghosties and paranormal things, what I really want to hear is the voice of the person. And I'm frustrated by so many paranormal investigators that write books that go, I did this and I did that and I saw this and I did this and that, and I'm not interested. Look, you can all buy a tape recorder. Just interview the person. Interview the person and don't ask any leading questions. Just try them to talk about their experiences. So this is a transcript of what this lady said, and I found what she had to say so interesting that I really coaxed her to try and put in as much information as possible without putting a single word in her head. And this is what she said. So it's fair to say that a lot of unusual experiences do happen in the dark at night time, but often that can be, whether or not it's a coincidence, people may be either near sleep or in the state between waking and sleeping. However, this is what she says. The woman that reared me up, it was her daughter. It was Sally Dundas. I had a wee lamp on. I was in my bed 5 minutes, if it was 5 minutes. I was in my bed, propped up on the pillows. Next minute, she came from in the door, walked right up. She actually, walking or floating, whatever they do, she came right up to me, and I'll tell you, I got a fright. But she was saying something about Mary. I remember her saying Mary, but I got so afraid I threw the covers over myself and said, "What do you want? What do you want?" And when I took the covers down, she was away, and I never saw her since. That woman came up to me, just as if I'm looking at you just now, very, very clear. Now, the first thing to pick up, I did ask her to repeat her story with more detail, and I'm just about to say that, but it's important to say where somebody might just mere fact that she is in her bed, a skeptic will just say, well, she was asleep. But she is saying she was in her bed, 5 minutes, she had her light on, and she was propped up. She is most convinced she is awake, okay? So I asked her for more detail. Their faces are funny. Funny. It's queer looking. As plain as can be. That woman walked up to me, came right up to me. I don't know if they float, but you know, they look on their face. It's when you know they're dead. Just the look at them. I don't know. I can't even describe the look in the face. Horrible. I wouldn't say nasty. More like sad than nasty. The face just didn't look right. When she died, she was a real enormous woman, but she didn't look that size when she came. By the face, I knew it was her. The door was open a bit, and it was as if she came through the door, and she came right up to me. It was unbelievable. It was more like a kind of greyish. It was as if she, not like in a kind of cloud, but what could you say? God, I can still see her. It was as if she was in something, with something around her. It was like she had some kind of cloud, but it wasn't a cloud. It was as if she was still alive with the actual body, but it was the colour of her face, the look of the face. You know they're dead. You didn't know her. If you didn't know her, you know it was somebody that wasn't alive. It was frightening. There's just something about them that you know they're not alive. It was that quick. She was there like that, in a way like that. As soon as she walked through the door, I knew who it was, and I knew she'd been dead for years. That happened in the middle bedroom. So there you go. That's one of my favourite transcriptions of an interview, because I just think there's something tremendously evocative about. She's grasping to describe her experience, and it's the fact that she, I just love this. It was as if she was in something. I just love that. So that's something to ponder on. Another one of my cases, please. Right, here's one. Now, at the end of the day, I pass absolutely no judgment on the actual reality of any of my clients' paranormal experiences, because I'm not there to judge. Because it's kind of an ontological minefield. How do I know whether or not their experience was real? So what I do is I come right out. I used to be quite obsessed with, let's find out if this was real, but for me it's much more important to actually find a way to cope with it, or understand it, or find a way in which that person can better understand or deal with their experience. That's the really interesting thing for me, because at the end of the day you might never be able to judge whether or not something really happened or didn't. But here's something that I'm absolutely certain didn't happen, and it's very instructive. I organised what I would call an on-site investigation. A lot of paranormal investigators call it a vigil. Let's have a vigil. And they run around haunted places in the dark and behave in a ridiculous fashion. I try and introduce a little scientific element in which people have to sit in one place for a certain period of time. People swap round. They're not allowed to discuss their experiences. So you can try and correlate their experiences with some kind of previous experience and see if they match up. There's no point in going to somewhere you know is haunted and somebody going, I had a weird experience. Like, of course you did. What's more interesting is if you can match an experience, because then you've got something to say. I investigated, I think it is Britain's oldest music hall in Glasgow Trongate, the Britannia Panopticon. And did this in 2004. It was filmed as a documentary. The eventual edit that went out on BBC Scotland showed a very breathless team of people in the dark with a video camera speaking to a disembodied voice and hearing this back. Is anyone there? Blah, 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 blah. Okay, very good TV. Very good TV. And sure enough, people were having this conversation. I don't take part in the experiment. I set the experiment up and I stay out of the way. However, I was somewhat annoyed to see that the person that is in charge of the charity that preserves the building actually essentially did a bit of a pitch invasion, experimentally speaking, decided to invite themselves down into the basement and started to have this conversation with this noise that went. The BBC crew were there, and speaking to them afterwards. In fact, I may be going a bit too quickly. I turned up a bit annoyed that this was happening. One of the questions was, should Innes stay? Do you want Innes to stay? That's a no-go. I said, okay, I'll go away then. Anyway, the BBC crew were flabbergasted. One of the production assistants actually turned to me and went, "It was amazing." It was amazing. Now, they weren't the only people to hear the hissing. One of my other investigators in the same location early on the night heard hissing too. Here's what he wrote down. I make them write it all down. Location J, anyone? Strange hissing on my left. It's like someone's heavy breath on my left, sleeping. 12:10, temperature 16.8 degrees. I'm seeing movement to my left, shivers down my spine. More temperature readings. Noise to my left, more frequent. Saw movement behind brown chair. Could this noise be the pipes? 12:25, temperature 16.4. Capitals. Don't like this room. Keep on seeing movement. Have stomach cramp. I hear a crowd of people chatting, singing. Movement again at left hand side as if someone's pacing up and down. 12:35, another temperature check. And then basically the communication stops. Person not liking the place. Sees movement. Hears the hissing. Asks soberly in the midst of his journal keeping, could this noise be the pipes? Can anyone guess the punchline? Of course it was the pipes. It was the freaking pipes. See that drawing there when you see a room that's full of pipes that looks like a 1980s computer game? It was like that. There were pipes everywhere, and all you had to do was go back with a microphone and listen for 2 seconds, and it was like... But what's really instructive is not only do I have one investigator listening to that and getting all panicked, but they even say, could this be the pipes? But they dismiss it. And then we have another team of people who have a conversation. They are having a conversation with a hissing pipe, right? And they think it's an intelligible conversation, okay? Now you could be very generous and argue that the pipes were possessed by some kind of entity that was controlling the rate in which the air was being pushed through the pipes, okay? I'm not entirely against that idea, but it's interesting that this experience became something much grander in their imagination. Their imagination became, you know, something huge, and they got carried away with themselves. And I conduct quite a few of these investigations in these places in the dark. A lot of these investigations were set up essentially by spiritualists who still believe that your best chance to see a ghost or experience anything spooky is at night in the dark. I personally don't necessarily think that is the case. Lots of people actually have weird experiences during the day. People see ghosts during the day, but there still seems to be this this tradition of going to haunted houses at the dark, in the dark. Now, people think, well, you must be quite brave. You must be quite brave to do that, sit in the dark. Well, let me tell you about the thing that absolutely, I mean, it really does terrify me the most, okay? This is the thing that in all my years of experimenting and interviewing clients and communicating with them, this is the one thing that scares me and everyone else the most. Sleep, please. That one programme has done more psychological harm to the nation than any other. Now, when I started in this business, there was probably about a dozen paranormal investigation groups in Britain. There's now probably hundreds. There's probably no way to count the amount of people that now investigate the paranormal. And their lead is often this programme. Now, this programme is lots of people running about in the dark, winding themselves up. It's like, I don't know what the equivalent would be of and this terrifies people. People phone me up and their first question is, you won't do anything, would you? Well, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And the reason is because they've watched this programme and they think that we're like these people. It's the equivalent of pest control. Or you think you might have Do you think you might have rats, or you think you might have bees or wasps or something? Well, these people go about with big sticks going, hitting trees and going, let's see if there are bees in here, and they're terrified. It's no way to investigate anything, it's no way to behave. And also the fact is, we know that 99.9% of the content of these programmes is made up. It's fake. It's fake, it's made up. And the reason it's made up is because if they actually filmed what really happened, and I know this because I spend a lot of time in haunted houses and the dark people, nothing happens. Almost nothing happens. And it's not to say that nothing genuinely weird has ever happened on that show, because it has. Kieran O'Keefe, who was the resident parapsychologist, he cites 3 occasions in which, according to him, 3 genuinely weird things have happened. But I think that's a fairly accurate straight rate. Because people say, oh, my house is haunted, everything's terrifying, it's terrifying. Oh, I can't sleep, it's absolutely horrible, horrible, horrible. Now, of course, when that's happening to you, and you don't understand what's happening, and your head's full of this nonsense, then of course you're going to worry. But when you unpack it, and when you actually ask them what really happens, then they might actually have a weird and unusual experience that might happen for like 2 or 3 seconds, maybe once or twice in a week, or a fortnight, or a month. And it's my biggest job is taking the fear out of the dark. It's actually trying to put a big shock absorber, a dampener on people's imagination. Because for me, when you actually do look into the dark, it's the dark mythologically, the dark paranormally. There is no reason to think of it as particularly terrifying. It is the wiped floppy disk. It is the tabula rasa. It is what you think it is. Hesiod was right. Darkness is the mother of all gods, but also all monsters. Can we have the last slide, please? So, what to take away from this? Well, it's interesting that you can't think about darkness without thinking about the light. And it's interesting when you talk about a lot of the themes that the other artists talked about was border, subliminal, liminal spaces. And there's one word that as a paranormal investigator that I use above all others. Can you guess what the word is? It's ambiguous. It's ambiguous. Paranormal thrives in grey areas. It's not black or white. And what's really interesting is when you actually look at psychical research and also parapsychology, they've actually found that psi or psychic power happens in more classically random situations. Why do you think tarot readers shuffle cards? Why do you think people read tea leaves? And when people try and affect physical systems, then the more unstable or random those physical systems are, the easy it is to manipulate them. So there's something about instability, there's something about ambiguous. And just to say one last thing about the spiritualists in their defence, or indeed all paranormal phenomena. Very interesting British psychologist called Kenneth Batchelor. And he had this notion, why is it that so many tremendous psychical performers, the mediums, the big names, were also caught at it? Skeptics would dismiss them entirely as frauds. But the same people that investigated them used to say, well, yeah, we know we caught them at it, but we can also not explain how certain things happened. So Batchelor had an idea, and it's actually an idea that's repeated a lot through the occult and ritual magic. We all have an innate fear of psi, an innate fear of the unknown. In the same way that we fear the darkness, it's possibly not because the darkness is full of monsters, but because the darkness is full of gods. That embracing the unknown potential within ourselves, we could become far more than we actually are, and it terrifies us. So Psi terrifies us. A remote viewer, called Robert Monroe, said the biggest problem was to out-of-body journeys was the fear factor. People are terrified to leave their body, and once they leave their body, they're terrified to take it further. An occultist called Peter J. Carroll said that we all have what he called the psychic sensor. We're afraid of it. And what Kenneth Batchelor did was he designed, or essentially redesigned, one of the very first psychic experiments to detect fraud. Before seances, people used to do what were called table turning or table tipping, in which they would put their fingers on a board and it would start to dance. And Michael Faraday, yes, him, he designed an experiment in which he designed essentially a table with another top that had rollers underneath it that would detect people's muscular action moving the table. Now what Batchelor did is he thought, well, do you know what? There's a tradition in the occult. Why do you think fakers are called fakers? It's because they initiate paranormal and magical events. By initiate, fake it. So he thought, well, let's see if this works. He had people do table tipping and levitation, and he designed it so he would detect whether or not there was any muscular movement in the table. But he told one of the people to start it off, fake it, you start it off. And when nobody was told to start it off with a fake, nothing happened. But when one person started off with a fake, which he could detect, things happened. The table moved without their muscular action. So Batchelor was very interesting, and I actually came across a case in which a teenage daughter confessed. The big panic was, oh, it's all happening, and then she eventually confessed, well, actually, see all that other stuff, I did fake that, but the last thing wasn't faked. And a lot of people just say, well, you know what, it's all fake, you can't trust her. But it's more nuanced than that. And that's why there is such a problem with the paranormal, because grey areas, ambiguity, is where it all seems to be. So, we have the last slide, please. Any questions? Oh, a bit hands straight up there, yes.